This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. Artists are stereotypically known for having big egos. We hear stories about actors throwing tantrums on set, or musicians and their ridiculous green room demands, or the eternal war between the chef and the food critic, and these are all well-worn tropes. But I think ego isn't good or bad, but I do think it's essential for any artist, and there's a balance that has to be learned. Let's start out by defining the word ego, because it's one of those words we just use wrong in our everyday language. When we say that guy has a big ego, we usually mean a bunch of negative traits like he's arrogant or condescending or self-important or conceited. It's a descriptive word to describe someone who feels superior to everyone else and how he acts around everybody. But the fact is that every single one of us has an ego, everyone. And if we didn't, there'd be a big problem. I'm going to give you a super basic breakdown of where this idea of ego comes from because I think it's helpful. And it dates back to the 1800s and Freud, who was starting out psychoanalysis and basically birthing modern psychology. And he broke down our drives and our conscious and subconscious into three basic groups. We have the id, we have the ego, and we have the superego. Let's start out with the id. Freud suggested that our most base drives are just purely there to help us survive in the moment. So it's things like aggression, fight or flight in the face of things happening to us, and it's where our base animalistic drives live, like sex. And he would suggest that we're all born pure id. We're born just with that knee-jerk response to situations that says just survive through this, and obviously procreation of the species into the future. It's not really concerned with future consequences or even the reality of the now. It's a knee-jerk reaction. It's a drive that's often subconscious that comes out of us. But as we grow up, we develop other parts of ourselves, like the superego. And that's that part of ourselves that understand that we're not the most important thing. Sometimes we have to sacrifice in order to make a healthy group or society. I mean, parents around the world now are saying something to their kids like, you can't run off and watch cartoons right now. You have to help us clear the table before you go. And we're teaching them and saying you have to delay gratification for the things that you want sometimes so that you can have a healthy group, a family that you're a part of, and a broader society that you're a part of. We're teaching them to have a moral conscience, and that's where the superego lives. Now, Freud suggested that the ego sits in between these two. It negotiates between them. It takes our base needs in our id and society's needs and norms, and it works out how we as an individual fit in between the two, how we have our needs met, but also are part of a healthy society and know how to fit in. It's the balance. As part of the work the ego does, it creates a sense of self, how we see ourselves, how we understand ourselves, who we are, what our personality is, what our drives and needs and wants are, and how we fit in to the broader picture. And that kind of work isn't good or bad, it's just necessary. So how does this relate to artists? Well, let's start by talking about where I think the ego is essential. I actually think artists need to be self-centered. And I don't mean that in the negative way we usually use it in our language. I mean, we need to know who we are. We need to know what we're trying to accomplish with our art, and we need to back ourselves when we hit resistance. I'll give you an example. So one of my favorite comedians, Ricky Gervais, hosted the Golden Globes a few times. And I remember watching one of the first, probably the first or second time that he hosted, and listening to the jokes he told. And yes, they were quite cutting and they were definitely designed to mock the people in the room, but it seemed to go down well watching it and people were laughing. But as soon as that event ended, the press went on the attack and the public started attacking him, saying, "How dare you tell those jokes? I'm very offended by what you've said." Shortly after this whole thing went down, he was invited to have an interview with CNN. And I remember the interviewer pressing him, trying to get him to apologize, to tell the public he's sorry he went too far. And I was so impressed with how held back and reserved Ricky was. He wasn't rude. He joked the whole way through. He was very happy, but he was totally unthreatened. And he said, you don't understand what comedy is. Comedy has to be true to some extent for it to be funny. And that means that sometimes jokes will cut close to the bone. But I back everything I said. And if I had to say it again, I would. Whether he was right or wrong really isn't the point. What impressed me was how he handled the criticism. I mean, imagine he's sitting there on live television with an interviewer, knowing there are hundreds of thousands of people out there who are angry and want an apology, an interviewer who's pushing him to recant, and he just sits there quietly, unashamed, and he backs himself. At one point, he actually said to the interviewer, what do you think I do? Do you think I just go up there on the night and I just look around the room and start teasing people at random, making it up off the top of my head? He said, of course not. I'm a professional comedian. I sat beforehand and I scripted every joke, every single word of every joke, making sure that I could back everything that I've said. So when the reaction comes in, positive from some, negative from others, it doesn't matter because the words that I wrote were what I wanted to say and I back myself for having said them. And he actually said, if you do what you want to do in any art form, the way you want to do it for you alone, you're bulletproof. Now that could just be read as arrogance, especially by those who were offended, but I didn't feel that was the tone at all. I felt like he was saying, if you're going to put work out there, if you're going to produce any sort of art, decide beforehand exactly what you want to say. Then show the world. Then stand next to that piece of art and say, I did that, no matter what the response is. And I really respect that. I recently went out for a drink with a friend of mine who's writing a book. And he was talking about the fact that he was struggling to know where to point the book. He could write it in a particular direction that would meet those people over there, but then he'd lose these people. But then if he wrote it for those people, these people wouldn't be interested. So he didn't know quite how to tone the book, where to direct it with the language that he was using. And I said to him what I'm saying to you here. I think as an artist, you have to write it for yourself. You have to write the book that you would want to read, and that takes a healthy ego. So paint the painting you want to see, write the book you want to write, shoot the movie you want to shoot. I mean, it's how I approach this YouTube channel. I don't try copy other channels or fit into the YouTube world. I try shoot videos that I would like to watch sitting down at the end of the day that would inspire me. I mean, take my street photography, for example. Other street photographers tell me you can't call what you do street photography. It doesn't really fit in that category. And my answer is always the same. I don't mind what label you put on it. I'm shooting the images that I want to see, that I enjoy taking, and I'm going to back whatever I shoot, no matter what label you want to put on it. I think a healthy ego is actually the best way to give your work proper focus. If you're always trying to please everybody or reach the widest possible audience you can, no matter what, then you're actually going to reach no one properly and effectively. I often thought that the worst thing that could happen would be that everything I produced would just be ignored and that I would be rejected, but I've changed my mind on that. That stuff I can't control. The worst thing that could happen would be that I would put out middle of the road, ineffectual blandness that would reach no one effectively because I was afraid of offending somebody. Because if that happened, I would only have myself to blame. We can take the risk of yelling something we really believe with our art, or we can retreat to a corner whispering something because we don't actually want anyone to hear because we know criticism will come. And I really want to err on the side of volume rather than caution, and I know that that will require a healthy ego. But we also know that our ego can hold us back. I'm going to be honest with you, I struggle with the negative side of ego. I have an ego that can get toxic and destructive. I like to have people impressed by what I do, is the truth. I want people to think I'm successful, and being very honest with you, I'm not actually a successful photographer. I have no big clients. I don't have work just flowing in all the time. And I can feel when my ego wants me to start showing off about something or gets very defensive when criticism comes towards me. Truth be told, I battle that stuff all the time. And I know if I listen to my ego when it starts spewing that toxic stuff, and if I follow it down the road, it's going to ultimately destroy me. Some of you have been very kind in the comment sections on this channel saying that you really appreciate the honesty and the vulnerability here. But let me say that that's not a natural impulse for me. I have to do that deliberately and consciously and against what I would prefer to be doing, which is probably showing off like all of us. But if I do that, when I choose to tell you about my failings and my shortcomings, it's my real world willful denial of my ego's worst impulses because I don't want to be that person. You've heard me mention him on this channel before, but one of my favorite authors is a Franciscan friar named Richard Rohr. And he's gained some notoriety over the years. He's put out a lot of books and speaks around a lot. And he talks very honestly about his ego's impulses and how he can feel that the negative side of that wants to take that adulation and believe he's better than everybody else. He's the same as we all are. But what he does to counteract that is he gets down on his knees every morning and he prays and he asks God, he says, for one good humiliation a day. He's not some kind of masochist. He does this deliberately as a practice. He makes sure that that side of his ego is in check, that he's not taking that praise and letting it put him on some pedestal he doesn't deserve to be on. In the same way that the good side of your ego can help you battle criticism when it comes and stand by what you're doing, the negative side of your ego needs to be balanced out with a sober view of yourself. And sometimes little humiliations every day can help remind you who you really are. Ancient Rome used to have this great tradition where a general would go off and fight a war and win great victories. He would come back to Rome and sometimes the Senate would allow him a triumph, which was just a parade through the streets of ancient Rome. And the general would stand on a chariot, which was drawn by 4 horses. There would be troops going through and slaves and a bunch of the treasure that they captured. And on the back of the chariot would stand a slave, and the slave would hold the laurel wreath, which was a symbol of victory, over the general's head as they passed through, crowds and crowds of people screaming and shouting praise to this general. And the slave had a very particular job. That slave would whisper in the ear of the general, "You are only a man. You are only a man." When our ego is playing games, that's its best trick, is to convince us that we're separate and superior to everybody else around us. If we want to be healthy artists, we have to learn how to put that negative side of our ego in place, how to remind ourselves of who we are, not think better of ourselves than we should, because it'll drag us down a dark path if we do, and we'll lose our way. Here's the trick, and you have to do it in the moment. Remember that you are not your ego, and your ego wants you to think it is, but you're able to see the games your ego plays. So ask yourself, who's doing the watching? And if you can separate yourself off for it like that, then you can start to take control and make decisions for yourself and not just be dragged along. I listened to a podcast I really enjoy by a guy named Pete Holmes called You Made It Weird, and he's a stand-up comedian. He's had a lot of success. He's had talk shows, very successful stand-up specials. He had an HBO series called Crashing. I mean, all of that stuff gets into your head. I'm a success. And he talks about his own ego very honestly on his podcast and says that he had one day where he was sitting in first class on a flight and he knew that there was a fellow comedian sitting back in economy. And he thought to himself, I deserve to be here because I'm separate and superior to that guy who's sitting there in the back. And he caught himself doing it in the moment. He caught that ugliness. And he says what he does is he talks to his ego as if it's another person almost. And just that little exercise helps him to think about it. And he just says to his ego, thanks, buddy. Thanks for helping me in this moment. I know you're trying to protect me. I know you're trying to define my sense of personhood, but you've done what you need to do and you can relax now. And he almost quietens down within himself the shriek of the ego that needs to be heard in that moment and puts it back to bed so he can carry on with his day. And I love that kind of self-awareness because it reminds us that we're all bigger than the negative games our egos might try and play. So we all have an ego. We all need an ego. The trick is just to balance it out. On the one side, it reminds us of who we are, what we think is important, and what we're trying to say with our art. It's going to help us to stand by what we do. In the face of criticism and people trying to pull us off that path, it's going to give us the strength to keep going until we reach our goal. And on the other side, we have to be careful of those ego games that convince us that we're separate and superior to everybody else, that because we're producing art of any sort, that we're better than everybody else. We're still only human. And even when that praise and that adulation comes in, put it in the right box in your head. Don't let it take you off track and start making the wrong things important, and get back to producing work you're proud of. It's a well-worn path that a lot of artists make their greatest work when no one really knows who they are. And then that work gets recognized for what it really is, and these artists get put on a pedestal, and then they never seem to be able to get back to that greatness. It's a slow spiral down from there. And I wonder if it's because when they reach that climax, that point, and get all that adulation, if after that the wrong things start to become important and they lose the focus of what they were doing. Don't let self-importance distract you from making beautiful things. If we can learn this ego dance and use the good parts of it to give us focus, remind us who we are and what we have to say, all the while warding off that part of our ego that would like us to just chase fame and fortune, using our ego as a guide and not letting it become a distraction, I think it will make us healthy artists. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. If you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself for years now. And if you're a visual artist of any sort, a painter, a photographer, graphic designer, filmmaker, and you want to post your work on a website and have your work look really good without the website distracting, Squarespace have a load of beautifully designed, minimalist templates that will make your work look great. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com. and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.